I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to the Great Books course of the Wisdom School of Ubiquity University as we begin our September trimester in the year 2018. And I am particularly delighted today to be speaking to one of the most extraordinary individuals and extraordinary books that I think that I've ever read. The Autobiography of a Yogi by Paramahansa Yogananda. I can still remember literally the day that I picked it up in my late 20s and sat spellbound for several days reading the book. It had a tremendous impact on me. And for those of you who have read it, even part, all you have to do is get into the first chapter. You realize that you're encountering a life that is so extraordinary and such a challenge to our Western scientific notions of time, space, and causality. And yet, telling a story that's so simply put, unpretentiously formulated, and yet so compellingly told, and obviously incontrovertibly true, but defying everything that you believe is possible. So that is why I chose this particular book. You know, we deal with history and we deal with deep philosophical issues, and we all know that the world is in a precarious situation, and we are teetering on the abyss of destructiveness. So I wanted to just go into the autobiography of a yogi in some ways as light relief, but more profoundly as an opportunity to challenge the seriousness with which we take our mundane world. This is the life of a man born in the province of Uttar Pradesh, northern India, in 1893. And he lived until he died and passed rather in 1952 in the United States. He was a guru almost without peer. His life was a life of pure intent for transcendence and immanence as he traversed first India, and then was the Indian guru, the first Indian guru to spend most of his life in the United States. He discovered his own personal guru, Swami Youth, when he was 17 years old, and he was guided and through prophecies and various fortunes was led to go to the United States in 1920, in his late 30s. And basically he stayed in the United States for the next 32 years, with one sojourn back to India in 1935 and 1936, which coincided with the passing of his guru. So that's the short story of Paramahansa Yogananda. He established in the West Kriya Yoga. He established in 1920, the year he went to the United States, the Self-Realization Fellowship, which he headquartered in Los Angeles, and there he spent his life. That's the outside story of this great mystic. He wrote the Autobiography of a Yogi in 1946, just a few years before he died, at the request of many of his followers who knew that his life had been so extraordinary that it almost defies belief. And so what I want to do today is something that I've not done before. Normally I discourse for the most of the time and then open it up to some discussion. But this time I want to have everybody on this call to think of a instance that they personally know and have experienced, or they've heard about, that they would consider miraculous. Because I want us to think about and feel into what it means to live a life in which the normal rules that govern existence become so malleable, so elastic, that the paranormal becomes normal in such a profound way that the mysteries of the cosmos begin to imbue ordinary existence. So I want everybody to just think, have you ever experienced a healing? Have you ever experienced a miracle? Directly in your life. I want to hear about it. So I want to just move expeditiously through, and we'll start when I finish with Georgie. When I was talking with Georgie earlier today, she says, oh, I have an instance. So I want to hear about it. And there's nearly 40 of us on this call, and I'm sure there's going to be at least a third to a half of you that will be able to testify. Maybe you've walked on fire. You've done some fire walking. Maybe you've seen somebody else do it. Maybe you've experienced a deep healing that can only be explained through prayer. That is the life of Paramahansa Yogananda. And I'm going to read just 3 portions of his life. The first one, really in the first chapter. And I want to underscore one particular aspect of some of these great individuals that we have been contemplating, whether it's Jesus or Alexander or Julius Caesar or Confucius or Lao Tzu or the Buddha. When you think back over the last couple of years, those of you who've been in the course, we've dealt with many of the great personages. Almost all of them are accompanied by great celestial happenings. You know, the 3 wise men coming, following the star, and many people think, well, that's just mythology and all the portents around the birth of Alexander, even Gandhi. Those are just mythologies, but I want to challenge that. Maybe one of the things that happens when a great personage comes amongst us and blesses us with his or her life is that the cosmos conspires to produce genius or produce greatness. You remember the lives of the great artists of Vasari when he talks about Michelangelo. And he starts his chapter about Michelangelo and says that life of humanity is a tale of drudgery, suffering, and pain. And occasionally God looks down and in his infinite mercy decides to grace us with an experience of beauty. How else can you explain, asked Vasari, the life of Michelangelo, who at the age of 18, almost unschooled, produced probably the greatest masterpiece in marble ever constructed, the Pietà. Paramahansa had a similar birth. You'll remember from your reading of the text that he was very close to his mother and his father. He had a premonition of his mother's death. He was with his father in another town, and as he was lying, getting ready to go to sleep, an image of his mother appears to him and says, "Go wake your father, come immediately, I'm going to die." And he rushes into his father's bedroom and tells his father, "Mother's dying." And his father didn't believe it. And so they didn't leave until the next morning. And before they got back home, one of the friends came rushing to them saying, "Your mother is gone." And then I'll just take up the text. 14 months after mother's passing, I learned that she had left me a momentous message. Ananta, his brother, was present at her deathbed and had recorded her words. Although she had asked that the disclosure be made to me in 1 year, my brother delayed. He was soon to leave Bareilly for Calcutta to marry the girl mother had chosen for him. One evening, he summoned me to his side. "Mukunda, I have been reluctant to give you strange tidings. My fear was to inflame your desire to leave home, but in any case, you are bristling with divine ardor." My brother then handed me a small box and delivered mother's message. "Let these words be my final blessing, my beloved son, Mukunda." That's what Paramahansa's real name was. Paramahansa was an epithet given to him much later in his life, in the 1930s. "The hour is here when I must relate a number of phenomenal events following your birth. I first knew your destined path when you were but a babe in my arms. I carried you then to the home of my guru in Benares to see Lahiri Mahasaya as he sat in deep meditation. While I patted you, I was praying that the great guru would take notice and bestow a blessing. The master then called me up and seated you on his lap, placing his hand on your forehead by way of spiritually baptizing you. Little mother, he said, your son will be a yogi. As a spiritual engine, he will carry many souls to God's kingdom. My heart leaped with joy to find my secret prayer granted by this omniscient guru. Shortly before your birth, he had told me you would follow his path. In this way, my dear son, I came to know that your road lies far from worldly ambitions. The most singular event in my life brought further confirmation, an event which now impels my deathbed message. It was an interview with a sage in the Punjab. And I'll just summarize here. She went to see the sage, and the sage said to her, your stay on earth will not be long. Your next illness shall prove to be your last. There was silence during which I felt no alarm, but only a vibration of great peace. Then he said something, and this is what I wanted to just note. You are a custodian of a certain silver amulet. I will not give it to you today to demonstrate the truth in my words that she was going to die. The talisman shall materialize in your hands tomorrow as you meditate. On your deathbed, you must instruct your eldest son to keep the amulet for 1 year and then hand it over to your second son, Mukunda. He will understand the meaning of the talisman from the great ones. He should receive it about the time he is ready to renounce all worldly hopes and start his vital search for God. When he has retained the amulet for some years, and when it has served its purpose, it shall vanish. Even if he kept it most secret, it shall return whence it came. I proffered alms to the saint and bowed down before him in great reverence. Not taking the offering, he departed with a blessing. The next evening, as I sat with folded hands in meditation, a silver amulet materialized between my palms, just as the sadhu had promised. It made itself known by a cold, smooth touch. I have jealously guarded it for more than 2 years, and now I leave it to Ananta's keeping. Do not grieve for me, as I shall have been ushered by my great guru into the arms of the infinite. Farewell, my child. The cosmic mother will protect you. So let's think about this for a moment. The cosmic mother will protect you. Her guru predicted that Paramahansa Yogananda would be a great saint and follow in the ways of the spiritual seekers that have characterized India for thousands of years. She's traveling to another town. She meets a sadhu that she doesn't really even know, and he tells her, "You're going to die soon. And before you die, you need to give this amulet that's going to appear to you the next day in your hands while you're in meditation to your oldest son to give to your younger son a year after you die. And that amulet, in some strange way, will be a talisman for him to keep him on the spiritual path. And then at a certain moment, when it has served its purpose, it will vanish and return into the unknown." Take that in. That is the surrounding omens that Paramahansa was given as he began his spiritual journey at the death of his mother, but were so profoundly important to him that it gave him the clarity and the purposefulness to dedicate his entire life, completely celibate, completely austere, completely focused for one purpose: unity with the divine. Now, next time in the second lecture, I'm going to get into Kriya Yoga. I'm going to get into the laws of miracle. I'm going to really explore the deeper dimensions of an underlying substrate in reality that completely permeates at will the scientific laws of time, space, and causality. But for this session, I want to just simply tell two more stories. And move to chapter 19, where Swami Yuktasvar, his guru, with whom Paramahansa has been studying for many years, and there he was with a friend who had just come into the proximity of this great guru. And the tale is thus. That evening, Dejan, the name of his friend, accompanied me to the hermitage. In Master's presence, my friend received such spiritual peace that he was soon a constant visitor. And they then began to interact. And at one point, Sri Yuktasvar sends a message that he's not there. He'd been summoned to Calcutta in another city by an urgent note. The following day, they received a postcard from Swami Yuktasvar. I shall leave Calcutta Wednesday morning, he had written. You and Dejan meet the 9 o'clock train at Serampore station. At 8:30 on Wednesday morning, as they were getting ready to leave for the station, a telepathic message from Sri Yuktasvar flashed insistently in my mind. I am delayed. Don't meet the 9 o'clock train. I conveyed the latest instructions to Dejan, who was already dressed for departure. You and your intuition, he retorted, with a voice edged in scorn. I prefer to trust Master's written words. I shrugged my shoulders and seated myself with quiet finality. Muttering angrily, Dejan made for the door and closed it noisily behind him. As the room was rather dark, I moved nearer to the window overlooking the street. The scant sunlight suddenly increased to an intense brilliancy in which the iron-barred window completely vanished. Against this dazzling background appeared the clearly materialized figure of Sri Yuktasvar. Bewildered to the point of shock, I rose from my chair and knelt before him. With my customary gesture of respectful greeting at my guru's feet, I touched his shoes. These were a pair familiar to me of orange-dyed canvas soled with rope. His ochre Swami cloth brushed against me. I distinctly felt not only the texture of his robe, but also the gritty surface of the shoes and the pressure of his toes within them. Too much astounded to utter even a word, I stood up and gazed at him questioningly. I was pleased that you got my telepathic message, he said, with a voice calm, entirely normal. I have now finished my business in Calcutta and shall arrive in Serampore by the 10 o'clock train. As I stared mutely, Sri Yuktasvar went on. This is not an apparition. This is my flesh and blood. I have been divinely commanded to give you this experience, rare to achieve on earth. Meet me at the station. You and Dejan will see me coming towards you, dressed as I am now. I shall be preceded by a fellow passenger, a little boy carrying a silver jug. My guru then placed both his hands on my head and murmured a blessing. As he concluded with the words, Taba Asi, I heard a peculiar rumbling sound. His body began to melt gradually within the piercing light. First, his feet and legs vanished, then his torso and head, like a scroll being rolled up. To the very last, I could feel his fingers resting lightly on my hair. The effulgence faded. Nothing remained before me but the barred window and a pale stream of sunlight. I remained in a half stupor of confusion, questioning whether I had not been the victim of a hallucination. And then all of a sudden, Dijin returned and entered the room. Master was not on the 9 o'clock train, or even the 9:30, he said. Come then, I replied. He's going to arrive at 10 o'clock. And sure enough, the whole train was filled with light as they saw it entering the station. And just as they were taking that in, Sri Yuktasvar came into view wearing the same clothes I had seen a short time earlier. And he walked slowly in the wake of a small lad bearing a silver jug. How does this happen? What laws are accessible? That you can bifurcate, disapparate, telepathically communicate, and do so in such a casual manner that it is almost as if no miracle is intended. One more. This one is something that happened with Paramahansa. And this is an experience which is another dimension of what it is that we're dealing with when we're dealing with these kinds of realities. And that is the whole phenomenon of reincarnation and rebirth. Paramahansa grew in stature and in favor of God and men, as it says of Jesus in the Gospels. And very soon, even though Sri Yuktasvar continued to be his guru, Paramahansa became a guru in his own right. And he began to have disciples. And this is another story that he recounts that just challenges us in very, very profound ways. One day, he was addressing a young group of students who were accompanying him on an 8-mile hike to a neighboring hill. We enjoyed a picnic lunch after we reached our destination. I sat under a tree, surrounded by a group of students. Finding me in an inspirational mood, they began to ply me with questions. Please tell me, sir, one youth inquired, if I shall always stay with you in the path of renunciation. Ah, no, I replied. You will be forcibly taken away to your home, and later you will marry. Incredulous, he made a vehement protest. Only if I am dead can I be carried home. But in a few months, his parents arrived to take him away. In spite of his tearful resistance, and some years later, he married. After answering many questions, I was addressed by one lad named Kashi. He was about 12 years old, a brilliant student, beloved by all. This is an incredible story. "Sir," he said, "what shall be my fate?" "You shall soon be dead," I said. The reply came from my lips with an irresistible force. This unexpected disclosure shocked and grieved me, as well as everybody present. Silently rebuking myself as an enfant terrible, I refused to answer any further questions. On our return to the school, Kashi came to my room. "If I die, Master, will you find me when I am reborn and bring me again to the spiritual path?" He sobbed. I felt constrained to refuse this difficult occult responsibility, but for weeks afterward, Kashi pressed me doggedly. Seeing him unnerved to the breaking point, I finally consoled him and said, "Yes, I promise. If the Heavenly Father lends his aid, I will try to find you." During the summer vacation, I started on a short trip. Regretting that I could not take Kashi with me, I called him to my room before leaving and carefully instructed him to remain against all persuasion in the spiritual vibrations of the school. Somehow I felt that if he did not go home, he might avoid the impending calamity. No sooner had I left him than Kashi's father arrived in Ranchi. For 15 days, he tried to break the will of his son, explaining that if Kashi would go to Calcutta for only 4 days to see his mother, he could then return. Kashi persistently refused. The father finally said he would take the boy by force with the help of the police. This threat disturbed Kashi, who was unwilling to be the cause of any unfavorable publicity to the school. He saw no choice but to go. I returned to Ranchi a few days later. When I heard how Kashi had been removed, I entrained at once for Calcutta. There I engaged a horse cab. Very strangely, as the vehicle passed beyond the Holroth Bridge over the Ganges, I beheld Kashi's father and other relatives in mourning clothes. Shouting to my driver to stop, I rushed out and glared at the unfortunate father. "You're a murderer," I cried somewhat unreasonably. "You have killed your boy." The father had already realized the wrong he had done in forcibly bringing Kashi to Calcutta. During the few days the boys had been there, he had eaten contaminated food, contracted cholera, and died. My love for Kashi and the pledge to find him after death, night and day haunted me. I could think of nothing else. No matter where I went, his face loomed up before me. I began a memorable search for him even as long ago I had searched for my lost mother. I felt that inasmuch as God had given me the faculty of reason, I must utilize it and tax my powers to the utmost in order to discover the subtle laws by which I could know the boy's astral whereabouts. He was a soul vibrating with unfulfilled desires. I realized a mass of light floating somewhere amidst millions of luminous souls in the astral regions belonged to him. But how was I to tune into him among so many vibrating lights of other souls? Now there's a challenge worth contemplating. Using a secret yoga technique, I broadcasted my love to Kashi's soul through the microphone of the spiritual eye. the inner point between the eyebrows. With the antenna of upraised hands and fingers, I often turned myself around and around and around and around, whirling, trying to locate the direction in which he had been reborn as an embryo. I hoped to receive response from him in the concentration tune radio of my heart. The heart is the radio. Your third eye is the antenna. You're spinning round and round and round and round, trying to attune yourself to the astral planes, to pick up the resonance of one astral soul among millions. I intuitively felt that Kashi would soon return to the earth, and that if I kept unceasingly broadcasting my call to him, his soul would reply. I knew that the slightest impulse sent to Kashi would be felt in my fingers, my hands, my arms, my spine, and my nerves. With undiminished zeal, I practiced the yoga method steadily for about 6 months after Kashi's death. Walking with a few friends one morning in the crowded bazaar section of Calcutta, I lifted my hands in the usual manner. For the first time, there was a response. I thrilled to detect electrical impulses trickling down my fingers and palms. These currents translated themselves into one overpowering thought from a deep recess in the depths of my consciousness. I am Kashi. I am Kashi. Master, come to me. I am Kashi. The thought almost became audible as I concentrated on my heart radio. In the characteristic, slightly hoarse whisper of Kashi, I heard his summons again and again. Master, I am Kashi. Come to me. I seized the arm of one of my companions and smiled joyfully at him. It looks as though I've located Kashi. I began to turn round and round and round and round, to the undisguised amusement of my friends in the passing throng. You're in the Safeway, right? You're in a supermarket. You're in whatever, but it's happening. It doesn't matter what people think. You got to stay with what the spiritual experience is without embarrassment. The electrical impulses tingled through my fingers only when I faced toward a nearby path, aptly named Serpentine Lane. The astral currents disappeared when I turned in any other direction. Ah, I exclaimed, Kashi's soul must be living in the womb of some mother whose home is in this lane. My companions and I approached closer to Serpentine Lane. The vibrations in my upraised hands grew stronger and more pronounced. As if by a magnet, I was pulled toward the right side of the road. Reaching the entrance of a certain house, I was astounded to find myself transfixed. I knocked at the door in a state of intense excitement, holding my very breath. I felt that the successful end had come from my long, arduous, and incredibly unusual quest. The door was opened by a servant who told me her master was at home. He descended the stairway from the second floor and smiled at me. I hardly knew how to frame my question, at once pertinent and impertinent. Please tell me, sir, if you and your wife have been expecting a child for about 6 months. Yes, it is so. Seeing that I was a Swami, the man said to me, pray, inform me how you know about my affairs. When he heard about Kashi and the promise I had given him, the astonished man believed my story. He took me in to see the mother. A male child of fair complexion will be born to you, I said. He will have a broad face with a cowlick atop his forehead. His disposition will be notably spiritual. I felt certain that the coming child would bear these resemblances to Kashi. Sure enough, the child was born. And later I visited the child, whose parents had given him the name Kashi. Boggles the mind. It boggles the mind. Even in infancy, he was strikingly similar in appearance to my dear Ranchi student. The child showed me an instantaneous affection. The attraction of the past awoke with redoubled intensity. Years later, the teenage boy wrote me during my stay in America. He explained his deep longing to follow the path of the renunciate. I directed him to a Himalayan master who to this day guides the reborn, Kashi. As I said, as we preoccupy ourselves with political affairs like Trump, climate change, building a university, doing all the mundane aspects of what we call human existence, some people are actually living human existence at such a deep level of cosmic synchronicity and alignment that it makes everything, at least that I do with my life, seem almost inconsequential and deeply tedious, given the struggle that is involved. So there's many more stories I could recount, including the one about Babaji. Maybe I'll end this session with the story of Babaji. And then, of course, next time we will go into some of the deeper intellectual reasons that have been applied to these phenomena, which are completely unexplained, but incontrovertibly true. I know there's probably going to be some of you who say, well, this didn't really happen and he made it up and so forth and so on. With all due respect, I'm not interested in hearing that because it's too superficial. I want this conversation to go deep. I want us to enter the unknown. So I want to open it up now to stories like the ones I have recounted that any of you have had that would echo in whatever way the profound narrative of Paramahansa Yogananda in his great autobiography of a yogi. And, you can raise your hands, those of you who are listening, but I want to hear from you. I want to hear stories of the miraculous now. And we're going to start with Georgie.
Thank you, Jim. Well, thank you. Another great presentation. I really share your enthusiasm about this book. Really, this book to me is more than just a story, a life story of a wise man. It is like showcasing the great mysteries of the universe. And as well as I found some fantastic, profound messages in a book, one of which actually I would like to read to you. It appears in chapter 5. He says, I have long exercised an honest introspection, an exquisitely painful approach to wisdom, self-scrutiny, relentless observance of one's thoughts is a stark and shattering experience. It pulverizes the stoutest ego, but a true self-analysis mathematically operates to produce seers. Indeed, he was a seer. I think he was not critical, but more open to the great messages of the universal information field. He understood that reality is more than just what one perceives through the five senses. But regardless of all that, he was an amazing person, and it is wonderful to reread this book again. So thank you very much for introducing his stories to us. I'd like to share two stories with you, one of which I have a proof it happened because Jim was there and some of our colleagues. And the story goes back to 2 years ago in Tibet. We were returning from Mount Kailash, and 25 of us were in a bus. It was early afternoon time, and we were in this huge, massive, expensive valley. And there were buses and cars in front of us and behind us. And it started to rain. There were great clouds, dark clouds gathering, and it was getting darker and darker. And there was no paved road whatsoever. We were on a dirt road. And all of a sudden we got stuck. We got stuck in the mud. So we were advised by our Tibetan leaders that we should just wait patiently and we will get out of the mud. So all 25 of us, we shared whatever food we had, the nuts and the crisps and the water. And after a while, after an hour or so, we got out of the bus and wandered around, but it was raining heavily. So we got back to the bus and we thought about, let's start to chant the White Tara mantra. So let's call in White Tara to help us out. Om Tare, Tu Tare, Ture, Swaha. We were chanting and chanting. It was amazing energy in the bus. And after probably like 10-15 minutes, an empty bus pulled across to our bus. We all looked in, just not believing what we were seeing. We all got out of the bus, got on the empty bus that took us through another couple of hours of arduous road to a hotel. I don't think any of us was in this belief that this was some coincidence. We don't believe in coincidence. We were calling intentionally the goddess of White Tara for help, and so it was provided. The other story, which is somewhat shorter than this, one of my Hungarian friends asked me to help her husband. I do energy healing once in a while. So as I was working with him, there were lots of images coming to me, one of which was an elderly lady in a white outfit. She appeared as a nun, and she had a big bunch of herbs in her hand. After we finished the session, I conveyed this image to him, and he looked to me and he said, "How did you know? This was my great aunt whose husband died in the First World War, and she became a nun, and also she became a herbalist." And I so much take after him. I'm a herbalist myself. I didn't know anything about this man, his past, or let alone he didn't share this story with anybody else. So it is wonderful to be connected to the great information field. And I think we all have that ability to read into it. We just forgot how to do it. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Georgie. And it is true what Georgie said about our trip to Kailash. That was an extraordinary thing when Georgie and a few of them started to do the mantra of the White Tara, and that single bus emerges out of nowhere to take us to where we needed to go. It was one of the most miraculous parts of that entire journey. And one thinks of the miracles that emanate from Tibet, and the challenges that the Tibetan seekers put to themselves as they develop their spiritual powers. I could tell a few Tibetan Buddhist stories, because I know Georgie can. But let's turn to some of the others. Will or Mark, do you have any tales of the miraculous you'd like to share?
Yeah, Jim, this is Will. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Georgie, and thank you, Jim, for taking us. What, for me, a miracle is an event that takes me to the edge of my usual pattern of ego, and also to the usual, at the edge and beyond the patterns of culture, into the deeper essence. And my sharing today is I had a little over a decade ago, I had heart trouble, and went through the usual tests, including the echocardiogram, and the cardiologist concluded that I needed surgery. So Judith and I were sitting on the couch contemplating the surgery, which was to come up in the near future, and the telephone rang. It was a call from a wisdom student, and she said, "Oh, Will and Judith, I just saw you on television on PBS." And I said, "Wow, what did you see?" She said, "Oh, you two were talking about a meridian therapy that you had worked with at Stanford University called EFT." And then I immediately recalled, hung up and sat down on the couch, and I immediately recalled with Judith that some years before, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, we had been at Stanford University working in an area called thought field therapy. And there had been some recordings there with an abbreviated version of that about how to stimulate different meridian points on your body, like I'm doing right now. And so we were talking about that, and suddenly it occurred to me that I had not engaged this particular way of opening myself in a number of years. So immediately I started this practice that we had worked on years before, and applied it to my heart trouble. And from there, every time my heart disturbance came, I went through this particular meridian sequence. And then we have a healing ceremony once a month here. And I began to open up, and the sounds of singing, the sounds of the conch, and so on came through an opening that was the result of these sequences. And about 3 days later, my heart felt entirely normal. I was scheduled to go in to visit with the cardiologist, so I wrote down in a one-page summary the interventions. First, the meridian sequence that opened up my inner field, and the sounds, the sweat lodge, the conch, the chanting that came through once I began to open up and got my the electromagnetic system of my body in harmony with the larger electromagnetics of the earth. That was my way of explaining it. So when I went to the cardiologist, he came in with his group of residents and asked me how I'd felt. And I said I was feeling good. And so he got out the old echocardiogram, and he said, "Well, your echocardiogram here says you're not feeling good." But I said, "What about the follow-up one, which happened after these interventions that I described?" So he got out the newer echocardiogram, and he said to his residents, I don't really believe in miracles, but this looks very much like one. And I said, well, I'm not going to explain it to you, but here's a one-page summary. And mainly, I just felt like being grateful.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, it's always good when the medical doctors have no other recourse, but the miraculous is a category of explanation. We'll get to you in a second, Mark. I'm just noting, looking at the students, one hand is up. Dave McQuarrie. Dave, do you want to share something? And then I'd like to hear from the rest of you. There's surely in this group of over 40 people, some stories of the miraculous that people can share. So I want to, there's Karen. So we'll get Karen next. So Dave, why don't you go ahead?
There's two stories I'll tell. One was, well, as you know, I'm a physician, and I was also a psychotherapist. In probably 1990 or so, I'd shifted from anesthesia to psychotherapy for about 6 years, and I was deciding that I would go back into anesthesia and combine the two. And so as I was thinking of that, an internist from the local hospital phoned me up and said, I hear you're going back into anesthesia. Would you like to work at our hospital? And I said no, because I needed to retrain. Otherwise, it could be a legal disaster. So, I just put it aside. He was on the one of the committees. So I do my retraining for 6 months, and I look all over North America for a job and don't find anything. I get onto a list, I don't make the short list, and that happens repeatedly. So around 5 months into my retraining, I remember this guy, and I phone him up and say, well, let's consider my coming back to the hospital. So he says at this point, well, I'm now the CEO of the hospital, or I forget the actual term, not the CEO, but the chief of staff. So he's in a more politically astute position, and we're still interested. Okay, so when can we talk? Well, I'm really busy these days. I got some time today at lunch. I'm free at lunch, so we have lunch together. I talked to him. I talked to the CEO of the hospital. I talked to the chief of surgery. I talked to chief of anesthesia. I have privileges in 2 hours to work at this hospital. That is totally unheard of in my experience of hospitals. Anyway, so I've now got a job. I go back to where I'm living, in a relationship with a gal, and we talk about, well, we need to change the character of our house. She says, the guy who built my house just went down the street. So we walk down the street, we talk to him, and he says, well, I'm building a house across the street. You can have that. And because I built your original house, I'll take your house in exchange. You pay the difference. So in 6 hours, I have a new job, a new house, and a new direction in my life. It astounded me in the synchronicity. The second one relates in part to the ending of that relationship about 5 years later. I'm moving from that town to another, and I drive close to the hospital, and I'm driving past a house that I really liked. It's on a country road, it's, beautiful country, et cetera, et cetera. And I see a for sale sign. I also remember that 2 weeks previously, I had a realtor join my therapy practice. In my 10 years of being a therapist, I'd never had a realtor in my practice. And I'm saying to myself, I can't afford it. So, I phone up the realtor and say, find out about the house. He says, it's for sale. He tells me the price. It's in a price range. 6 hours later, I buy the house. That kind of synchronicity has happened a number of times in my life. And as you know, I've had a number of mystical experiences. But those experiences just, blow me away in terms of what is the nature of life. You were talking about the pain and the mundane, and I'm convinced at some level that spirit, God, creator, whatever, presents us with experiences that move us on, in whatever direction we need to go. And that at some level, we're God's teachers, because God learns from our crazy adventures. Anyway, that's enough for me.
Thank you. That's an interesting question, actually, is what's the relationship between synchronicities and miracles? Are synchronicities exercises of the miraculous, or are they a different category? I'll just state the question. Maybe next time we can go into it more deeply. Hello, Michelle.
Hello. What
tale of the miraculous do you bear today?
Oh, gosh. Ooh, which one? I thought about one that still fascinates me, more so than the others. About maybe 5 years ago, I decided to do a class in remote viewing, an intensive week using binary sound, with a gentleman, Joe McGonigal, who was the U.S. Remote viewer during the Cold War. And he believed that there was a specific protocol that if one followed, that they could access that, the mind, the reality, not our normal existence. So I did that because I really wanted to become intimate with my own intuitive, like how do I train my intuition and trust my intuition? So we had this one day later in the week where they said, okay, we've been monitoring you at how you all have been, right, or how you've been recording your intuitive hits and your what they call gestalts. So we have selected a specific one for each of you that we would like for you to, draw the target that you are intuiting. And so I'm thinking, okay, and the first thing you do is you set your intention about, I would like to see this target. And so I did, and I found that my own intuition is that I have a sensory where I can, for example, the target was a metal building. It was actually this, and in a specific environment. And so I would actually taste metal in my mouth, and I would feel the color. I would feel the environment more than just seeing, or I'd have light impressions of shapes. So I had recorded all these gestalts, and the first thing you have to do is not judge what you just have to record what you are sensing. And so I get back and I have my drawings and my descriptions. And so they give us the target, they hand out the targets, and I get my target and I open it and I'm like, wow, I really did, my Western mind, I got an A. And what had happened was they had handed them out randomly, which means I was tapping into a future. I was tapping, so time ceased. So they did not select what I was going to draw. I drew it before I was given that specific target. And I still find that to be amazing, because time to me is what keeps me from tapping into that non-local reality, or my intuition, or being able to, if I have a thought, is it coming from past, future, present? And I think synchronicity is always the cosmic kissing, saying yes.
I love that notion of synchronicity being a cosmic kissing. What a beautiful notion.
Yes.
Well, I think we should hold that thought, because I think what Michelle is alluding to, the porousness between past and future and present and random and determinism, is at the heart of the miraculous. Yeah. Anything else you wanted to add?
Oh, I think synchronicity and miracles are happening all the time. I mean, many know that I have a fascination, or this number 72 that appears in my life, and almost daily, and in different really odd ways. And the more I learn about the 72, is that 72 is the heartbeat, or the calm heartbeat, the 72 beats. And that heart intelligence is really what connects us to cosmic. So I just, sometimes I just think this is just a wild ride.
Well, thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
I thank you so much for doing this, because I love the writings of Yogananda. I actually attended a seminar once that was based on the second coming of Christ, and I consider him the most inspired and inspirational interpreter of the Gospels, as well as the many other things that he did. And so, at any rate, I also want to share with you one very brief thing. I have this on my desk, the picture, and a brief quote from Yogananda, which says, "The love of God, the love of the Spirit, is an all-consuming love. Once you have experienced it, it shall lead you on and on in the eternal realms. That love will never be taken away from your heart. It shall burn there, and in the fire you shall find the great magnetism of spirit that draws others unto you and attracts whatever you truly need or desire." I love this, and I have experienced this. So I will make my miraculous experience short, since we don't have a lot of time, and that is that last year my mother died, my 21-year-old cat died, I broke my foot, and I was a miserable, depressed, cranky, crabby person. And so one night I thought, I'll have a pity party. And on that night, I was wanting to hear a hymn that I liked very much. I had never heard it sung, but I had played it on the piano for years just to make myself feel better. So that night I went on YouTube, and I saw a person in a tuxedo without glasses. I couldn't see much. I saw a tuxedo and a piano, and I love classical music. So I chose that. And when I heard this voice, to me, it was the voice of an angel of God. And my life changed in the instant I heard the voice. I jumped up, another person, and trying to see who was singing. So it turned out the singer is a professional singer who lives in Korea. And I couldn't read anything, not even a name. So over the next couple of weeks, while I tried to find out the name of the person or find out anything, I had my song and my changed life, and miracles started happening around me. So for other people, there was someone I had wanted very much to help who had a sick baby and a roof destroyed by the hurricane. And all of a sudden I knew how to help them. And that was, I wrote something for the local newspaper, which has an annual thing around Christmas for helping people who need help. And they loved the story that I wrote. They ran it. And 2 hours later, 2 roofers stepped forward to do the roof on the house of these people. Then their baby was accepted into a study, a genetic testing, or a genetic study that might save the baby's life, because otherwise the baby couldn't live. So things were happening. And then there was a miracle with money, where an investment I was divesting myself of the next day, I had already signed the papers, all of a sudden mushroomed into a huge amount of money. So it was like unbelievable. All these things were happening. So I wanted to find my singer in Korea and thank him for saving my life, because I felt that my life was renewed and completely different. And so I found him, and that night, instead of writing to him, I wrote to a friend saying, you know, I think this person is an angel sent by God. And I believe I know what's in his mind when he sings. I think he is singing for God and to God, and his life is all about God. But don't tell anyone or they'll think I'm crazy, because he sang one hymn and then a bunch of opera, Bocelli, you know, stuff like that. So why would I think this? I had no reason to think that he was a godly person. So I finished my email, and just then I got an email from the singer who wrote to me first. And he said to me, all he knew is that I said I liked his voice and wanted his email. So that's all he knew. He said, "Thank you for loving my songs. I am only an instrument of God." And then next he said, "I never imagined someone so far away would go to so much trouble to find me. I am only an instrument of God." Okay, so I didn't get it the first time, I guess. and so then he said, "I would like to stay in touch." Well, then I wrote him a crazy letter saying, "I just told my friend that you were singing all about God, and then you say you're an instrument of God, and oh, it's true, praise God." So fortunately, he didn't take any offense to my enthusiasm, and we became friends. And after that, then some other things happened that are really unusual. And that is that I was a person who was never sick in my life. I didn't even get a cold. And I always said, they, meaning the human race, they get sick. I do not. Okay. A little bit arrogant, wasn't it? I had some lessons to learn, right? But so I got sick in February. I got very sick. I had vertigo. I was hospitalized for several weeks. For 9 days, I couldn't sit up or even turn my head. So I was very sick indeed. During that time of sickness, I lost the hearing in one ear. And since I love music, this was it was worse to me than vertigo. It was more frightening. But a lot of prayers were being said. And my friend in Korea is indeed a very godly person and had been praying a lot. And so after 4 days, my hearing was restored. And the doctor who tested me while I was deaf and after it came back said, "Get a file folder, put these 2 papers in it and label it miracles, because this doesn't happen. When you lose the hearing for the reason you did lose it, it doesn't come back because it was a nerve that was attacked. That was the problem." So anyway, but I was still sick with vertigo. I was improving, but still ill for many months. I got to a doctor who was an expert on the subject at last, and they tested me and found out that the nerve in one ear was not functioning. So that was the cause of the vertigo. And I said, "Doctor, will it return? Could it return?" And he said, "No, it will not come back. We will teach you to live with it, but it will not come back." So 1 hour later, I went to my car and I thought, well, then I must serve the Lord without any excuses about my health, just like St. Paul in the Bible, who served God but had an infirmity. And at the moment I thought that, I went deaf in the ear that was affected now, the ear with the vertigo. And then I heard some strange noises in my ear, that ear. And then my balance was restored 1 hour after the doctor said it couldn't happen. And so anyway, many doctors now have told me that they consider this to be a miraculous thing because it was a proven, the nerve was dead and it came back to life. So it's certainly unusual. So the only other thing I can tell you is that recently I also had a knee problem, just recently. And on Sunday, I went with my friend to a church. It is not a church we attend, but they lay on hands and do things. And we did it because we've been in contact with some very bad people and we wanted help with that. But I mentioned also for help. And since that day, I have no more pain in my knee. So I wrote to friends last night and I said, I guess I will have to get used to miracles just being part of ordinary life, which is the thing that Jim gave us and why I wanted to share with you. And thank you so much. And thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. When the miraculous becomes the mundane, that's the way life should be lived. So thank you so much, Karen. I'm glad we fixed your mute problem. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Mark, and then Laura.
Well, thank you, Jim, and I really appreciate your bringing this topic up. I feel like it's really crucial because it affects our whole worldview, which can underlie so much about how we live our lives. I've made something of a study of the modern investigation of this kind of material, and I'd like to talk about 2 instances of people I've known personally who have had the kinds of experiences Jim is talking about. You had the various instances from Yogananda's life and fall into modern classifications of telepathy, crisis apparitions, future vision, and experiences of the reincarnation type. And I had the crisis apparitions is something that's been studied all through the century. And that's when, especially around death, it's that knowledge, that probably possibly telepathic contact we get when someone we're close to is at the point of death, right before death, or perhaps shortly after. And it turns out to be quite a common experience. There's been books written on this since the beginning of the 20th century. But I had one experience that was not personally my own, but I was quite close to. A student at one of my students at Yale had been visiting her grandmother, who was sick, and it was likely terminal, but she was doing all right, the grandmother. So the student comes back to New Haven, and she's an actress, a very sensitive person. Actors can often be. And she had was attending this is reported to me by her roommates who were with her, there were about 4 of them at the time, attending a performance at the Yale University Theater. And it was just at the start of an intermission when my student, I'll call her Mary, she said suddenly, "My grandmother just died." And this was before cell phones. She went out to a pay phone and called home. And in fact, that had happened. My grandmother had died. So that kind of experience, it turns out I raised that question in workshops I do, in lectures about this kind of issue, about who in the audience has had that kind of experience around someone's death. And it turns out that often 40% or so of the people there have had such experiences, or at least know somebody closely who has.
Yeah.
The other experience is more recent, and this has to do with the studies of a close friend of mine here in Houston, who is investigating this particular person. And the person, we'll call her Louise. Louise was struck by lightning, and she was not a particularly religious person. And I'd like to say that a lot of this happens outside of the strongly religious context. It's not just the religious adepts who have these kind of experiences. It can also have hit people with quite secular worldviews before the experience. And in this case, this person had, after her being struck by lightning and recovering, she started having dreams that were dreams of the future. And they tended to be the very near future and things that were public events. So, for example, she continues to have dreams about airplane crashes and would wake up, write this down so it would be dated on her email. And sure enough, within 2 days, an experience very much like what she foresees happened. One example was she had this vision of, in her dream, it was very odd because the plane seemed to be after the crash on a body of water, and all of these people were standing on the wings of the plane as it lay in the water. Well, this was, of course, a very widely publicized photograph 2 or 3 days later of the flight that involved the crash on the Hudson River, and there was a movie made about it. Captain Sulzberger, I think his name was, or something like that. And she has had these kinds of experiences prior to the event that are all documented, because she has written them down with dated emails prior to having the vision. So it's it raises the questions of whether she's really seeing the event itself or something in the ambience, the public media afterwards. But in any case, those are just two instances that reinforce my belief about particularly crisis apparitions and future vision. And with that,
well, thank you.
What you're talking
Thank you.
about.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, you get struck by lightning, all of a sudden you can start to see the future.
Yeah, yeah.
Figure, explain that one. So listen, we're running a little short on time. We've got Laura, and then I see Newtopia. I'm sure that's not your name. Maybe it is. But if we could just to be as concise as we possibly can, that would be helpful. And then there's a couple of other people, Banafshe and Emma, that we'll try to get to before we close off for today. But Laura, why don't you share your story?
Oh, I've got so many. I just, as I'm listening to people, it's so apparent to me that life is a miracle. And I have this, I've always had an availability to the mystical, to be that influence. And it's been a struggle for me as well, living in the world we live in, which doesn't recognize it. So it's created places in myself that I've struggled with. But I mean, my earliest was age 3 in the woods, and it was unitive experiences I realized that I was having. And then related to this book, which I'd read in my 20s, and then again I read in my, I would say, mid-40s, late 40s. And I'd had an experience when I was 8. And the connection to India is very strong, even though I was only there once. And I was in an altered state the whole time, even though I was traveling around. But this connection was very interesting because I'd read the book. But with this 8-year-old experience that I've had 4 near-death where I should have died. I've made medical history twice now. This was one of them when I was 8, and I had a severe concussion, and they couldn't fly me to a hospital that could take care of it. So it was just a wait and see for 8 days with a 24-hour nurse sitting by my side because they didn't have what they have now, machines and everything. And I remember coming to very clearly, like it was last week, and I looked into these blue eyes and blonde. There was she had blonde hair and blue eyes, and it was so intense that we just, because this kid had finally woken up, she was staring at me, and I was staring at her because wherever I'd been, we all had one eye. We had one eye, and it was like when I described coming back, like I was completely disoriented. I knew I'd been somewhere, and I always thought, well, I was on another planet. I was in another reality. And I could remember bits, like everything was telepathic. Everything was in balance. Like it was just this sense, and even as I talk about it, I feel it electrically in my body. There was a perfectness to it, and not in a neurotic perfect sense. It was just balanced. So everything mattered. Whatever, even just a slight hand movement, everything had significance. And so zoom ahead. I wasn't ready, obviously, to take it in my 20s when I read the book. But there's a part in this book, I haven't got to it yet, this will be my 3rd reading of it. But in my 40s, my time to read was at night in bed. So I'm lying there and I'm reading. And I start reading when Sri Yukteswar came back after he had died and basically gave Yogananda a lecture on that he had to let him go because he was busy working on this planet, and like the name of it starts with an H. And he's describing what he's doing, and he's a teacher on this planet. And I'm reading it, and the whole field around me is electrical, and I realize that's the planet I was on. That's where I went. That's my home. It was my astral family. I knew it. And so I have a beautiful connection to this book through that. But as I say, don't even remember reading that in my 20s. I don't even remember, and I devoured that book. I lived, it lived me, it breathed me. So anyway, I'll keep that short. I could go on.
Well, thank you. Hey, I'm sorry for about the tyranny of time. We got an utopia here. We can just do it in a minute or two just to give some headlines. That would be helpful. And we'll continue this narrative next time.
My story happens in 1979. I'm in my hometown, Greensboro, North Carolina. And there is the communists had organized this Death to the Klan march. And I went. I had been recruited by the communists. I was a poetess, and they liked my poetry because it was about social justice. So I went to this march in a poor part of town, and they were expecting that the Nazis and the Klan were going to show up. And there weren't many people. This is a small town. The communists came down from the northern states, and they were working in the factories. They were doctors. They were theologians from Harvard and Yale. And they were working to try to organize unions and health issues like white lung disease. So I agreed with a lot of what they were doing. And so I was at the Death to the Klan march. There weren't many people there. I talked to my friend Sydney, who her husband was one of the doctors and the leaders. And she said, yeah, we think they're going to come, the Klan and the Nazis. And I just got this voice in my head. It was like a really loud voice, and it said, get in your car and leave right now. This is not where you're supposed to be, and this is not your group. And so I had the choice whether to listen to that voice or not, but it was a really loud voice. So I got in my car and I left. And several hours later, I don't pick up hitchhikers. There's not many hitchhikers to pick up anyway. And I picked up this hitchhiker as I was doing an errand, and he tells me that there had been a shootout in Greensboro. 5 people were killed, number of people were injured, and it had made international news. And they refer to it now as the Greensboro Massacre. So I'm really happy I listened to that voice. And it was very interesting after that because my connection with Sydney, I got into seeing what the aftermath was with the Communist Party and how they were reacting to the media, because now they had international media attention. And I don't know, I was never in the inner circle. It was just a tragedy, and they had this moment of history in order to make their message known. And you can feel when you're in that kind of historical moment, there's a certain energy about it. Yeah. Yeah. And that was also very interesting, but I listened to the voice, And I realized from that that I'm much more of a mystic, and that's my path.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I wanted to get to Emma. Hi, Emma.
Hi, everyone. I'll make this very, very short and synthesized. One thing I'd like to add is that the first time, many, many years ago as an adolescent, when I first read the book, I felt so much in me that Paramahansa Yogananda was normalizing the experiences that I had had as a child, and that no one else did, no one else in family and culture and society. So it was such a gift that he had given me. From that, and again, there's many, many other experiences in between, but from that, I went on to study as a scientist. And so at this point, I not only teach or have taught for many years a very traditional intro to psychology class, but I also have taught through the years an introduction to parapsychology classes. So at this point, as I reread, he gives me a gift again to continue with the work and to continue it at another level to help be somewhat of a bridge to those other realities, but also to this reality, and to help people know that this is quite okay. This is very, very normal. And when we do not look at it in a normal way, that's when we kind of get into quote unquote trouble. When we don't listen to our intuition, that's when we need to go further. So I guess it's synthesized, and I can certainly get into that, more so later, but trying to balance the two and trying to really listen to those and be part of those experiences that Paramahansa Yogananda has so much gifted us with.
Thank you. Thank you. Linda has her hand up as well. You're just making a little chat. Life and being alive is a miracle. What we call the mundane is actually the illusion. That was my initial response also. Well, good. Well, listen, thank you, Linda, for that. And then we're a little bit over our time, so we'll have to bring this session to a close, unfortunately. It's been an incredibly rich session, and we'll do it, go into more depth next time. But Banavshe, why don't you have a final word, and then I'll just wrap up a few things. Share whatever you have.
I just shared in chat what I wanted to say. I'm good. Please do your ending.
Oh, no, why don't you say it? Since you have the floor, go ahead and say it.
No, I just think being alive is a miracle. And the more we feel that, the more that becomes what is ordinary. And to live our life thinking that what we do is the mundane is actually an illusion to me. And I was very moved that you shared the part about him whirling and attuning with the whirling to the astral plane. I feel the whirling really puts us in touch with how living and life is a miracle. And in a very physical way, we experience that. So that's all I wanted to share right now. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you, everybody. This has been a very rich discussion, and I really appreciated the texture and the diversity of the sharing, and whether it's just the voice saying "get out of here now," or being struck by lightning, or being in the middle of nowhere in Tibet and just doing the White Tara mantra. It's an extraordinary thing, isn't it? How the cosmic and the finite interpenetrate one another, and that we find ourselves with each instant at a portal in some ways to both the mundane and the mysterious. And I think this is a powerful thing for us to contemplate in a world that is spinning ever increasingly out of control. And we're all looking for places around which we can anchor. And I think that the profundity for me of Paramahansa Yogananda's chronicle of just simply his life is that eternity is all around us and can actually be accessed almost any time. And for that, I'm very profoundly grateful. So we'll pause here. Next month, we'll probably have a few more stories. For those of you who haven't read it, just treat yourself to one of the truly great books, the Autobiography of a Yogi. Once you start, I guarantee you won't be able to put it down. Because the miraculous just sweeps you along. And you joy at the fact that you're alive. You're just simply alive in this wonderful, wonderful world. So for those of you who are students, I'll probably send out an email over the next couple of days, but we want to start to have a dialogue on the Ubiquity platform, the student forum, and Great Books group. But I'll send an email on that. But thank you, everybody. This has been a very rich conversation. So until next time, bye-bye.